questions now, but I next like to introduce our key speaker, who is Dr. Nina Friggens. And Nina is a postdoctoral research fellow at Exeter University, and she's presently investigating the carbon cycle in the Arctic and permafrost regions. Her academic career to date has been concerned with understanding the dynamics of plant-soil interactions and their effects on soil carbon storage and climate change. And I have to say, she's got her name to several publications, and I can only think that she's either an incredibly bright, clever, dynamic person, or she's got amazing anti-aging properties, because she's very young and she's done so much. So I'd like to introduce you to her now. Thank you, Nina.
Hello everyone, my name is Nina Friggens and I'm a researcher at the University of Exeter. I'll be talking to you today a little bit about the links between above and below ground ecology and how changes which occur above ground also have knock-on effects below ground. And we'll be exploring this by looking at carbon and how carbon is transferred from above ground into the below ground and also vice versa. To tell this story, I'm going to use illustrative species and plants that we recognise from the British countryside. So here we have a tree that could be a pine species, and also we have some shrub species, heather, that you could, for example, find on a moor. And in the context of a carbon story, the role that we commonly associate with plants is that plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they store this carbon dioxide as carbon in their plant biomass. But this isn't necessarily the full story. Plants don't just sit on soil, but they sit in soil, where the roots of plants interact with and depend on the link between soils and roots. And within this interface between the plant root and the soil, there's a whole host of interactions and processes which go on. One of them is mycorrhizal fungi, illustrated in grey here. And these mycorrhizal fungi associate symbiotically with plants, and they're extremely common. So almost 90% of land plants form some kind of mycorrhizal association. And this symbiosis is built on a relationship where the fungi receives carbon from the plant in exchange for nutrients and water which it forages within the soil. Other important relationships and interaction include relationships with bacteria and also with free-living fungi in the soil, as well as with soil fauna, so animals within the soil that feed on the fungi and bacteria, but also feed on organic matter within the soil. And if we follow then the carbon in the story, the carbon gets taken up by the tree, and a huge proportion of this carbon taken up by trees is allocated below ground to maintaining relationships and growth within the soil. So a lot of carbon is stored in plant roots itself. A lot of carbon is allocated to maintaining mycorrhizal relationships, which are important for plant health. And also some of this carbon will get respired back into the atmosphere as soil respiration or root respiration. And some carbon from the plant will get fixed and stabilized in the soil. And this creates a carbon store in the soil, a huge storage unit for carbon which exists right below our feet. In order to understand just how important soil carbon storage is in a global context, it's useful to look at this infographic which depicts global carbon pools compared by mass as variously sized boxes. And In this infographic, it displays an atmospheric carbon pool, so the carbon dioxide in the air, a vegetation carbon pool, so carbon stored in plant biomass, a fossil fuel carbon pool, which will include oil and gas and coal, and then a soil carbon pool. And it is immediately obvious that the soil carbon pool is much, much bigger than any single of the other carbon pools depicted. And in fact, if we take the atmospheric carbon pool, the vegetation carbon pool, and the fossil fuel pool and add them all together, then we get just over 2,500 gigatons of carbon, which is still significantly less than the carbon stored in soils alone. So soil is the single biggest carbon pool within a global context and significantly bigger than carbon stored in atmosphere, vegetation and fossil fuels combined. In the UK, soils store around about 4,500 megatons of carbon, but this carbon isn't evenly distributed across the UK. As we can see from this carbon density map, a large amount of carbon is stored in Scotland and also a significant proportion in Northern Ireland, as well as some parts of England. In the southwest, we can see large carbon stores in, for example, Exmoor and Dartmoor, as well as pockets distributed throughout Cornwall. And in UK forests, which are commonly perceived to be a large above-ground carbon store, it turns out that according to forest research, 75% of total carbon stored in forests is stored within the soils. So I hope that I've been able to impress upon you just how important soil carbon storage is, both in a global context and a UK as well as local context. In order to understand the links between above and below ground processes, as well as carbon cycling, it seems pertinent to focus on the most direct link between plants and soils, and that is mycorrhizas. As I alluded to earlier, mycorrhizas are symbiotic fungi which form relationships with most land plants, and this relationship is based on an exchange of carbon from the plant into the fungus in return for nutrients and water which the fungus scavenges and mines from the soil profile. And mycorrhizas come in lots of different flavors depending on the type of association that occurs and the plant species with which they associate. And today I'm going to focus on two of these, which are relevant in the context of wild spaces within Britain, but also some previous work that I myself have done. One of these is ectomycorrhizas, which commonly associate with birch and pine trees, and they form long exploration types. So this means that they extend the reach of the plant root far into the soil. They also have a rapid turnover within the soil. So they grow very quickly, but also die and decompose very quickly. And they themselves can break down soil organic matter. So the ectomycorrhizas have the potential to decompose organic matter within the soil. The other mycorrhizal type that we'll be looking at today is ericoid mycorrhizas, which associate with ericoid plants such as shrub species like heather, commonly found on moors. And ericoid mycorrhizas have melanized hyphae, which makes them very tough and robust, which makes them also resistant to decomposition. And this means that they have a slow turnover in the soil profile. So they grow slowly, and when they die, they decompose very slowly. And this means that they promote soil carbon accumulation within the soil profile. So if we now imagine a scenario where we have a transition from a moorland into a forest, this could be a natural situation where the trees have naturally regenerated and grown on moorland soils, or it can be a more man-made scenario where trees have been planted onto moorland soils. In this transition, there'll be a change above ground in the community composition, the species present, and the general ecology occurring above ground. But what we must remember is that that change in species and ecology also is mirrored below ground. So when above ground we have a shift from moorland to forest, below ground we have a shift from an ericoid dominant mycorrhizal type to an ectodominant mycorrhizal type. And with this, what I'm trying to illustrate is that changes in vegetation affect the whole ecosystem, not just what occurs above ground, but also what occurs below ground because of these interactions above and below ground. And in some of the work that I've done, we have actually looked at and tested the effects of this transition from an ericoid dominant to an ectodominant ecosystem and what that means below ground and what that means for carbon. And this is a schematic representation of that work. So in this experiment, which was conducted in Scotland, we compared heather moorland control plots against plots which had been planted with pine trees or birch trees 12 and 39 years previously. And what we found was that there was significantly more carbon stored in soils below heather moorland plots than there was below the pine or birch plots 12 and 39 years later. Now, when we accounted for the carbon both above and below ground, we still found that the heather moorland plots stored more carbon than any of the planted plots, and that the carbon which was gained above ground in tree biomass in the planted plots was not enough to offset any of the carbon lost from the soils caused by the presence of the trees. And we suspect that this has something to do with this transition from an ericoid dominant moorland to an ectodominant woodland. So why does planting trees onto moorlands cause a loss of soil carbon? Well, we think it has to do with the mycorrhizas, this focal link between plants and soil. And if you recall, the main role, so to speak, of the mycorrhizas in the symbiotic relationship with trees is to source nutrients from the soil. And one of the key nutrients in soil, which is important to plant growth, is nitrogen. And nitrogen is what I'll use in this example. Nitrogen in the soil is most often stored as a complex organic molecule, which means that as well as nitrogen in this complex, there's also carbon stored there and other molecules interlocked in this organic compound. Now, the ectomycorrhizas have the capability and the enzymes to break down that complex organic molecule in order to access the nitrogen. So the nitrogen gets absorbed into the mycorrhizas and later gets transferred into the tree. But the mycorrhiza is only interested in the nitrogen and less interested in the carbon, which the mycorrhiza themselves receive from the tree. But this leaves the carbon now broken down in the soil matrix, which makes it much more accessible to and also vulnerable to the free-living fungi and bacteria in the soil, which effectively consume, eat, and metabolize this now much more readily available carbon, which in turn gets released as respiration, decomposition, and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So, where we risk loss of soil carbon stores is when we plant plants with a high nitrogen demand on soils with a large carbon stock. And this risk of carbon loss when planting trees onto carbon-rich soils has been picked up by and mapped by the RSPB, who have recently published this map where the red depicts the higher risk soils which have a large pre-existing carbon stock, which might be vulnerable to loss if trees were to be planted there. And the blue illustrates lower risk soils, where there's a much lower risk of carbon loss from the soils. And so what we can see from this map is that there are quite a lot of areas where planting trees may not result in net carbon sequestration. So planting trees may not lock up carbon in the way that we maybe desire it to from tree planting. But that there are also ample spaces across the UK where planting trees onto mineral soils, the blue here, would most likely result in locking up of carbon in tree biomass as well as in soils, resulting in net carbon sequestration. Now, there may be many other reasons to plant trees, including biodiversity and livelihoods, but in a carbon context, this map illustrates areas where we have a high risk of carbon loss and where we have a low risk of carbon loss, and therefore is better to plant. So when people say planting the right tree in the right place, these are the types of maps and this is the type of research that gets us closer to understanding where that is. One of the questions I often get asked when I talk about planting trees and the effects on soil carbon and carbon sequestration is, but what about natural regeneration of forests? And to understand that, we need to look at scenarios where forests and moors or heathlands occur side by side in a natural situation. And to illustrate this, I'll be using an example from the very north of Sweden, 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where I've also done quite a bit of work on these similar questions. And I did promise that I wasn't going to show very many graphs, but I couldn't resist squeezing this one in, because it so brilliantly illustrates that in the tundra heath, there is a significantly larger amount of carbon stored than there is in the birch forest. And this is including the carbon above ground in the forest. So even in a natural environment, where there's a natural regeneration and transition from heathland to forest, we see that in the birch forest, the ecosystem as a whole stores significantly less carbon than the tundra does. So to summarize some of the things we've touched upon here, where we've looked at linking above ground and below ground processes in both a planting scenario and in a naturally regenerating tree line situation. The main driver of carbon dynamics within a forest to moorland or a forest to heath transition is to do with plant production and nitrogen demand. So in forests which have high plant production and therefore high nitrogen demand, we also have ectomycorrhizal nitrogen mining and lots of fast organic matter turnover and not very much soil organic carbon accumulation. In the moorland or in the heath, we have much lower plant production and a much smaller nitrogen sink. We have virtually no ectomycorrhizal mining, and we have soil carbon accumulation. So these beautiful moorland landscapes, familiar to us across Britain and the southwest, might just store more carbon than meets the eye, because of carbon and nitrogen cycling processes facilitated by specific symbiotic fungi in the soil. And we must remember to account for change, not just above ground where we can see it, but also below ground, where there's a whole host of soil processes which are linked to above ground processes and change as well when we see change above ground. And it's vitally important that we value our current carbon stores and work hard to first and foremost keep them in the ground and also work towards potentially growing these soil carbon stores into the future. And with that, I'll leave you with my favourite comic strip and this truly beautiful soil sample to remind us all that soils are magnificent and beautiful and a true wonder. Thank you all very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Nina. That was absolutely amazing. I think we do have time for a very quick question, if there are any.
There are some very good questions in the Q&A. We'll start with one from Jocelyn Murgatroyd, who would like to know, from Nina's blue and red map, there were loads of white unmarked areas. What is the carbon effect of planting trees there?
So the white areas in that map are essentially data gaps. So they're areas which haven't been able to be mapped as the rest has. So it could be that there wasn't enough data to support an estimate of whether it was a high risk or a low risk soil, or simply that there were too many confounding factors, and the modeling that went into generating that map wasn't able to spit out a prediction for that area. So the only areas of that map that we can look at and understand with confidence are the ones that are either blue or red. But it's very pertinent to say, and a good observation, that of course there are lots of unmodeled and unmapped areas, and that's sort of part of ongoing research and where we need to plug those data gaps so that we can understand, you know, across a much broader area of the UK what the consequences potentially of tree planting would be.